let's talk about boundaries. Not as walls to keep people out, but as gates that protect what is holy, right? Because God himself is a boundary setter. The first thing he gives Adam and Eve in the garden is not a rule book. He gives them a boundary, right? You are free to eat from any tree, but not the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They had freedom within limits. And that's what love looks like, right? So today we're going to unpack why boundaries are spiritually essential, emotionally healing, and neurologically regulating, and how to set them without guilt or fear, right? Because boundaries are not selfish. They're sacred. And God uses boundaries from Genesis all the way through Revelation, right? In Genesis 1:4, he separates light from darkness. There's a boundary. In Job 38:11, he limits the sea so it won't overtake the land. There's a boundary. He commands the Israelites not to move ancient boundary stones, right? In Proverbs 22:28. Why? Because boundaries protect design. Even Jesus modeled boundaries. He withdrew from the crowds to pray. He didn't heal everyone. He moved as the Father led him. And he said no to the Pharisees' manipulations and didn't explain himself. Right? Can you imagine that? Why do you think they were so up in arms? He didn't even bother to explain himself. He just said no. And he let the rich young ruler just walk away. Right? Godly boundaries are not about pushing people away. They're about stewarding what God has given you. Okay, so let's go back to Proverbs 6 for a moment. A little sleep, a little slumber, and poverty will come on you like a thief. And that's Proverbs 6:10 through 11. Or a person who stirs up conflict in the community, Proverbs 6:19. These are warnings, not about sleep or conflict alone, but about the lack of restraint and the absence of order and the chaos that unfolds when boundaries are not in place. Okay, because here's what happens when we don't have boundaries. We overfunction in relationships. We get trapped in guilt and resentment and burnout, and we become vulnerable to manipulation. That's a biggie. And then sometimes we even mistake codependency for compassion, right? So let's look at the neuroscience behind that, right? Because if you weren't taught safe boundaries early on, your amygdala, it becomes hypervigilant. And your nervous system confuses peacekeeping with survival. You say yes to stay safe, and you say nothing to avoid rejection, right? But silence is not love. Okay? We need to be obedient. We need to have boundaries. So how do we begin to set godly boundaries? Well, first we've got to start with clarity, not confrontation, right? Boundaries are not ultimatums, okay? They're definitions. So a boundary would be, I can't continue this conversation if there's going to be yelling. Or I'm available between 2 and 4 today. Or that's not something I can take on right now, right? Jesus didn't justify or over-explain. He just stated what was true and followed through. And that's all we need to do. No explanation needed if you're not available at 1 today because blah, blah, blah. No, I'm available between 2 and 4, right? That's setting a boundary and doing it well. Number 2, use scripture to strengthen your own backbone. Right? Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. That's a command, not a suggestion, by the way. Guarding your heart doesn't mean be hard. It means be wise about what you allow in and what you allow to stay. Right? Because sometimes we don't want to allow things in, but they come in anyways through our broken cracks and bits. But we don't have to allow it to stay either, right? We can move it along and have it leave, right? And number 3, expect pushback, right? But don't confuse guilt with conviction here, okay? Because when you didn't set boundaries and now you start setting boundaries, people who benefited from your lack of boundaries will feel uncomfortable. And that doesn't mean you're wrong, okay? Galatians 1:10, am I now trying to win the approval of people or God? Right? Conviction leads to peace, guilt leads to bondage. That's the difference. So learn to discern the voice of the Spirit from the voice of your past. Okay, when those people start pushing in on you because they're not benefiting from you anymore, don't let the guilt create bondage. Instead, let it be peace. Know that it's a conviction. I'm not here for this right now, or I'm not here for this anymore, right? And then number 4, let the boundary do the work. Okay, you do not have to beg people to respect you. You hold the boundary consistently, and over time, people learn how to interact with you. It may not be comfortable, right? And if they don't, well, that's data, not failure. You're just taking this in. Don't adjust the boundary just to keep a relationship. Because if you have to adjust a boundary that you in your heart know is right just to keep a relationship, then maybe God meant that relationship needs to go. Right? And then observe the relationship to see if it fits within God's boundaries for your life. Right? Because God has boundaries for your life, and they're there for a reason. And so let's go to Psalm 27. David is under threat, surrounded by enemies, and he says, one thing I ask from the Lord, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. Psalm 27:4. So beautiful. What do we see in this, though? He's not panicking. He's not plotting revenge, right? He's not over-evaluating his enemies. He's not judging what his enemies are doing. He's regulating by seeking God's presence, right? Boundaries flow from that place, from knowing you are safe in God and you no longer need to prove, explain, overextend, or perform in your life, right? Through my father and my mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me, right? That's the kind of identity that makes boundaries possible. Your mother and your father can turn their back on you because of a boundary that you made. Your child can turn their back on you because of a boundary that you made. Your spouse can, your friends, your coworkers, they can all turn their back on you because of a boundary that you made. But if that boundary was made out of true conviction, the Lord will always receive you. And that's fine, because you're not defined about what others think about you. You are defined by the one who calls you his, right? And maybe, as hard as it sounds, sometimes in our life, family members often will step themselves outside of God's boundaries for your life. And that's not for you to control. And yes, it hurts. And yes, it can bring heartbreak. But you have to trust God's boundaries for your life. They're there for a reason, right? And so sometimes we have to let them go, let them forsake us, and let it be okay. And if they return, they do, right? So if you've struggled setting boundaries, just let this be the week that you ask yourself, where do I need to guard what God has given me? Where am I not doing that? Or maybe what guilt have I mistaken for goodness, right? Or, and this one's even bigger, where am I saying yes to people but no to God, right? That's a big one, right? So I hope that this week, maybe you can, step into at least one boundary, set it, settle into it, whether it's comfortable or not, and just see what God does with that.